A farmer bought an abandoned barn for pennies. Everyone laughed at him and called him crazy, but when he went inside and opened it, his life changed forever. The day Marcus signed the papers, the air smelled of rain. He stood outside the courthouse, holding the thin folder of documents that said, in cold black letters, that the barn and the land surrounding it were his. It had cost him less than the beat-up pickup he drove to work every morning, but the weight of the purchase pressed on him far heavier than any price tag could. It was not just a transaction, not just another line in the dusty records of the county clerk's office. For Marcus, it was the beginning of something he had chased for years, a dream too fragile to confess aloud, one he had clutched silently while others laughed at the idea of him ever owning something of his own. The small town where he had lived most of his life had never truly embraced him. They tolerated him, nodded at him at the hardware store, or waved politely when passing his truck on the single road that cut through the valley. But he was not one of them. He was the son of itinerant workers, the boy who had picked fruit and hauled hay while others went off to football practice or spent their summers at the lake. His father had died young, his mother had bent her back in strangers' kitchens, and Marcus had grown up with the understanding that nothing would ever come easily. The color of his skin marked him as different, but it was the dirt under his nails and the patched shirts on his back that set him apart most clearly. From the time he was a teenager, Marcus had longed for a piece of land to call his own. It did not need to be grand or fertile or enviable. It only needed to be his, a place where no one could order him to leave at the end of a harvest season. No landlord could raise the rent. No boss could cut his hours. For years he had saved what little he could, always finding his small hoard of money diminished by bills, truck repairs, and the endless emergencies that came with a life balanced on the edge of poverty. The dream retreated further each time reality intruded, until it seemed destined to fade away altogether. Then one gray morning, while sipping weak coffee in the diner before work, Marcus noticed a scrap of newsprint folded into the corner of the local paper. A notice of sale, hardly larger than a matchbox, caught his eye. Property for sale, 1 barn and surrounding acreage, as is. Contact courthouse for details. It listed no price, just an address he recognized vaguely as the far edge of town, where fields turned into overgrown lots and forgotten properties decayed beneath the weight of time. The barn, he later learned, had belonged to an old farming family whose last heirs had moved away decades ago. Since then, it had stood empty, slowly collapsing into itself while stories about it fermented in town gossip. Nothing but a pile of wood waiting to fall on some fool's head, one of the farmers muttered when Marcus asked about it later that week. Others chuckled, spinning rumors about curses, about drifters who had squatted there and vanished, about sounds at night that couldn't be explained. But Marcus did not laugh. The more they dismissed it, the more he felt something stir inside him. Perhaps it was stubbornness, perhaps desperation, but he decided he needed to see it for himself. When he first stood before the barn, his breath caught. It rose against the horizon like a wounded giant, its roof jagged where beams had snapped, its doors sagging off their hinges, the boards gray and splintered from decades of storms. Weeds climbed the walls like ropes of green fire, and the yard around it was swallowed by waist-high grass. To any passerby, it was an eyesore, something to be bulldozed or burned. Yet Marcus saw more than ruin. He saw possibility. In the broken timbers, he imagined shelter. In the cracked foundations, he imagined roots. In the hollow echo of the place, he imagined a home. The purchase itself was laughably simple. No one else wanted it. The heirs had long since stopped paying taxes. The county wanted it off their rolls, and Marcus's modest savings were enough. Signing his name on the deed felt unreal, as though at any moment someone would snatch the paper away, laughing that it had all been a mistake. But the ink dried, the clerk stamped the documents, and suddenly the barn was his. That night he drove out again, unable to resist. He parked his truck at the edge of the overgrown lot, headlights cutting tunnels through the thick grass. When he killed the engine, silence rushed in, broken only by the high whine of crickets and the far-off croak of frogs in the canal. The barn loomed above him, black against the moonlit sky. He stepped closer, his boots sinking into the damp earth, the smell of rot and old wood pressing around him. The doors groaned when he pushed them open, swinging just enough to reveal the cavernous darkness within. Inside, the air was heavy with dust and the faint sweetness of long-decayed hay. His flashlight beam wavered across rusted tools, broken ladders, the skeleton of a cart left to collapse under its own weight. The floor creaked beneath his steps, each groan of the wood sounding like a protest at his intrusion. Yet with each step, Marcus felt something stronger than fear. A current of energy pulsed through him, a sense that he had crossed into a place where stories lingered, waiting to be told. He spent hours walking slowly through the barn, touching the splintered beams, brushing cobwebs from the walls, listening to the whispers of the place. His mind swung wildly between exhilaration and dread. Could he really make this his home, or at least the beginning of one? Could he restore what others had abandoned? The enormity of the task pressed on him, and for the first time that day, doubt seeped in. Perhaps the townsfolk were right. Perhaps he had thrown his hard-earned savings into a hole from which nothing good would emerge. But as he stepped back outside and gazed at the barn silhouetted by starlight, a strange calm settled over him. He remembered his father's voice, the rare nights when exhaustion had not dulled the man's spirit, telling him that land was more than soil and wood. Land was a promise, a legacy. Marcus straightened his shoulders. The barn was broken, but it was his. He would not let laughter or fear undo that truth. Yet beneath his determination, unease coiled. There had been something in the way the floor sagged in places, the way certain corners seemed too carefully concealed under piles of debris, the way the wind inside the barn carried whispers different from those outside. He had bought a ruin, yes, but he had also bought its secrets. And as he closed the doors and climbed into his truck, he could not shake the sense that the barn had been waiting for him all along, patient and silent, like a beast watching from the dark. The following days passed in a blur of labor and sweat as Marcus devoted every free hour to the barn. He would wake before sunrise, pull on his oldest jeans and a faded work shirt, and drive out in his pickup with the bed loaded down by tools and supplies. The barn greeted him each morning in silence, its crooked roofline etched against the paling sky, its shadow stretching across the overgrown field. To anyone else, it might have looked like a monument to futility, a carcass of wood and iron fit only for demolition. To Marcus, it looked like the fragile shell of something still breathing, still waiting. He had no illusions about the enormity of the task before him, but the need to act was stronger than doubt. If he stood still too long, the voice of fear would creep in, whispering that he had made a mistake. So he filled the days with movement, with effort, with the steady rhythm of work. The first challenge was the wilderness that had claimed the land around the barn. Grass grew as high as his waist, weeds knotted themselves thick around rotting fence posts, and thorn bushes spread like barbed wire through the soil. Marcus set to work with a scythe and a rusted mower he had borrowed from a neighbor. Hours of cutting and hauling left him drenched in sweat, arms burning, back aching, but each swath of cleared earth revealed more of what lay beneath. As the tangled jungle gave way, he uncovered the faint outline of a once-tended yard, the remnants of a path leading to the barn doors, and the long-buried stones of a low wall that had marked boundaries decades earlier. With every foot of ground reclaimed, Marcus felt the first faint stirrings of ownership settle deeper in his chest. This land was his now, and with each cut of the blade, he was claiming it not only in deed, but in spirit. Inside, the barn proved more daunting. The air was perpetually thick with the smell of mildew and rot, and sunlight poured through jagged holes in the roof in narrow shafts, illuminating floating dust like spirits caught midair. The floor was layered with decades of debris, broken boards, tangled rope, rusting nails, rotting hay that disintegrated at his touch. At first he moved cautiously, testing each step, wary that the weakened planks might give way beneath him. The barn creaked and moaned around him, every sound amplified in the cavernous space, every whisper of wind stirring a shiver in his skin. He began by clearing the obvious: stacks of broken tools, long forgotten, the carcass of an old wheelbarrow, wooden crates that collapsed into splinters the moment he tried to lift them. The work was exhausting, yet strangely meditative. He imagined peeling back layers of history, each rusted hinge or snap beam, a clue to the lives once lived here. He wondered about the farmer who had hammered these boards in place, about the children who might have played in the hayloft, about the hands that had left fingerprints on the walls before vanishing into memory. But as he worked, Marcus noticed details that unsettled him. Some corners of the barn seemed deliberately concealed beneath piled boards, as if someone had wanted to keep them hidden. Heavy locks hung from chains on doors that opened onto nothing but small storage spaces, their contents long gone. And the floor bore strange marks, grooves gouged deep into the wood as though something heavy had been dragged across it again and again. Each discovery whispered that this place was not merely abandoned. It had been used with purpose, and perhaps with secrecy. One late afternoon, when the sun had begun to bleed orange through the broken slats, Marcus unearthed his first true mystery. He had been clearing a mound of dried weeds and rotting timber in the far corner, a place where the shadows gathered thickest. Beneath the rubble lay a set of boards that did not match the others. They were heavier, denser, stained darker by years of moisture. Kneeling, Marcus ran his fingers along the edges and felt a faint seam. His heart quickened. The boards were not part of the floor at all, but a cover. He pried at them with a crowbar, and with effort they shifted, revealing the iron loop of a handle. His flashlight beam caught the dull gleam of a padlock, long corroded but still intact, securing the boards over what was unmistakably a trapdoor. Marcus sat back on his heels, breathing hard, staring at it as though it might vanish if he blinked. The barn, which had seemed so empty, so barren of promise, had just revealed a secret it had been holding tight against the world. Yet the discovery filled him not with triumph, but with unease. The lock was thick, far stronger than what one would expect for an ordinary storage space. The boards were cut to fit so snugly that he wondered how many times they had been lifted and replaced, and by whom. He leaned closer, pressing his ear against the wood, half expecting to hear some echo from the depths. Only silence answered, heavy and unmoving. Marcus did not open it that day. His hands itched to break the lock, to know what lay beneath, but instinct told him to wait. He would need better tools, better light, perhaps even another pair of hands. The barn was treacherous enough above ground. Who knew what dangers lurked below? The thought of descending unprepared into darkness filled him with an animal dread he could not ignore. So he replaced the boards and stood slowly, brushing dust from his jeans, his eyes never leaving the corner. That night, lying in bed, the image of the trapdoor haunted him. He imagined what might be below, a storage cellar filled with forgotten tools perhaps, or hidden caches of supplies. But darker thoughts crept in as well. Rumors of bootleggers from long ago, whispers of smugglers who had used barns and warehouses to conceal contraband. What if the stories told by townsfolk carried some truth, and this barn had been more than a place to store hay? Sleep came fitfully, punctuated by dreams of footsteps echoing under the earth, of voices carried through the floorboards, of eyes watching from the gaps in the walls. When he woke in the dim gray of dawn, he felt both drawn to the barn and wary of what awaited him there. The following days, Marcus returned to work, but his attention was no longer on the roof that needed patching or the beams that sagged dangerously. His focus circled always back to the corner, to the hidden boards and the rusted lock that seemed to pulse with secrets. He cleared the barn with renewed vigor, as if by stripping away every layer of debris he could get closer to understanding the place. Each discovery, an iron tool blackened with rust, a wooden chest that crumbled at his touch, only deepened the mystery. By the week's end, the barn looked changed. Piles of junk had been hauled outside, weeds had been cleared from its base, and light moved more freely through the gaps in the walls. Yet Marcus knew the true heart of the barn still lay buried beneath that trapdoor. The air around it felt different, heavier somehow, as though the ground itself was guarding something. He found himself lingering by it in silence, crouching to study the lock, pressing his fingers against the seam where the boards met. He wondered who had last opened it and what they had left behind. Perhaps no one had touched it in decades, or perhaps it had been visited more recently, its secrets replenished and sealed once more. Each evening, as he locked up and drove home, Marcus's thoughts chased themselves in circles. He imagined treasures hidden below, collections of tools, artifacts from another era. But he also imagined darker things, evidence of crimes, objects best left buried, histories that would cling to anyone foolish enough to disturb them. Still, the pull was irresistible. The barn had given him its first gift of mystery, and he could not walk away. When he looked at the structure now, he no longer saw only decay. He saw a puzzle, a layered story waiting for him to peel it back. And in the restless nights when sleep eluded him, he knew it was only a matter of time before he returned with crowbar and lantern in hand, ready to wrench open the trapdoor and step into the darkness below. The barn had been silent for decades, but in revealing its secret, it had chosen him as its witness. And though Marcus did not yet know what awaited him beneath the floor, he knew with certainty that his life would never again be the same. The nights that followed his discovery of the trapdoor were restless ones. Marcus would lie awake listening to the old house he rented creak under the wind, his mind turning again and again to the iron loop hidden beneath those warped boards. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw it, the lock corroded yet stubbornly unbroken, the seams in the floor whispering of something sealed away for decades. He tried to tell himself that it was only storage, that perhaps the former owners had simply used the space as a root cellar or to stash tools when storms came. But the thought refused to comfort him. There was a gravity in that corner of the barn that his instincts could not dismiss, as if the earth itself held its breath beneath him. By the third night he realized he would never know peace until he forced it open. So he prepared. He bought a heavier crowbar from the hardware store, a length of rope, and a lantern with a new battery that promised hours of light. He kept his purchase quiet, avoiding the curious looks of the store clerk, who seemed on the verge of asking what exactly he intended to do with such things. Marcus had never been much for conversation anyway, so he kept his head down and let the weight of the items in his hands remind him that he was moving closer to revelation. The following morning, with a thermos of coffee and his determination bound tight around him, he drove out to the barn before the sun had fully risen. The barn was cold when he entered, shadows stretching long across the floor as the first light of day filtered through the gaps in the boards. He could smell the dampness from the night's dew, feel the moisture clinging to the air as though the building itself exhaled secrets. The sound of his boots echoed across the emptiness until he reached the corner where the boards hid the trapdoor. He stood there for a long time, listening to the silence, his heart thudding in his chest. Then kneeling, he set to work. The lock resisted at first, its rusted body groaning under the force of the crowbar. Each strike sent vibrations up his arms, the sound unnaturally loud in the cavernous space. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the chill. Finally, with one last desperate heave, the lock gave way, snapping open with a metallic crack that seemed to reverberate through the entire structure. Marcus paused, breathless, waiting for something. He did not know what, but nothing came. The barn was silent again, the dust settling in the beam of his lantern. He hooked his fingers into the iron loop and pulled. The boards lifted grudgingly, as if reluctant to surrender their burden. The smell of earth and mold rushed up at him, thick and damp, and the cold air from below coiled around his arms. He pushed the cover aside and aimed the lantern into the opening. A narrow set of stone steps descended into darkness, slick with moisture, each one worn smooth with age. For a moment, Marcus only stared, his breath caught. It was not just a cellar. It was something deeper, older, meant for more than potatoes or tools. Lantern in one hand, rope coiled around his shoulder, Marcus set his boots on the first step. The stone was cold beneath him, the air heavy with the scent of mildew. He moved slowly, cautious of his footing, his free hand brushing against the wall to steady himself. The silence thickened as he descended, broken only by the drip of water echoing somewhere unseen. The light from the barn above shrank quickly until it was only a pale glow, and then it was gone entirely, leaving only the halo of his lantern. At the bottom of the stairs, the space opened into a chamber. Marcus swept the lantern around, and his breath caught again. Stone walls enclosed him, low and arched, their surfaces slick with moss. Wooden shelves lined the perimeter. Many collapsed under the weight of years, their contents spilled across the floor. Old crates leaned drunkenly against one another, their lids warped, iron nails rusted to powder. The ground was uneven, a mixture of dirt and stone, damp in patches where water seeped through cracks. He moved carefully, the beam of the lantern catching on the shapes of forgotten things. In one corner lay a stack of helmets, the kind worn by soldiers long ago, their paint faded, some dented as if they had seen battle. Nearby he found fragments of rifles, wood rotted away, but the iron still recognizable. A shiver ran through him as he touched one, imagining the hands that had carried it, the eyes that had looked down its sights. These were not the leftovers of farm life. This was history buried in the dark. As he explored further, Marcus uncovered boxes filled with yellowed papers, sealed in waxy envelopes. The ink had bled in the damp, but he could still make out faint stamps and dates from decades past. He knelt to examine one and realized it bore military markings. What had the owner of this barn been doing with these? Why had he hidden them beneath his floor? Marcus's pulse quickened as the questions multiplied. In another chamber, accessible through a narrow archway that forced him to duck, he found something stranger still. Against one wall rested the rusting skeleton of an engine, its parts scattered like bones across the ground. The design looked old, older than any machinery he had worked with on farms. Next to it lay wheels, chains, fragments of leather saddles. He realized with awe that these were remnants of early motorcycles, their pieces left here to rot. He thought of the lock, the effort to conceal this place, and wondered if someone had once intended to salvage them, to rebuild, but had never returned. Everywhere he turned, the underground rooms spoke of obsession. There were jars of bolts sorted by size, tools arranged in rotting boxes, bundles of wires coiled carefully as though waiting for use. And yet everything was covered in decay, as though time had reached down here and claimed it, despite the attempt at preservation. Then in a chest pushed against the far wall, Marcus found the most personal relic of all. Its lid was swollen shut, but he pried it open with effort, and inside lay a leather-bound book. The cover was cracked, the pages curled with damp, but the writing within was still legible. He lifted it gently, brushing away mold, and saw a name scrawled on the first page. It was the name of the man who had once owned the farm, a figure Marcus had heard whispered about in town but never truly known. This was his hand, his thoughts, his account. A diary, a record of decades. Marcus sat on the damp ground and flipped through a few pages by lantern light. The entries were uneven, sometimes only a line or two, sometimes sprawling across the paper. They spoke of acquisitions, of trades made in secrecy, of collections gathered from distant places. He read of dealerships that had closed, of parts bought in bulk, of engines taken when no one else wanted them. There was pride in the words, but also something darker, a determination to hoard, to hide, to keep safe what the world would otherwise scatter. Closing the book, Marcus held it against his chest. The underground had revealed not only relics, but a life, a mind that had been consumed by the need to collect, to preserve. And now that life had ended, leaving behind only the echoes sealed under the earth. For a long time he remained there, listening to the quiet, the steady drip of water, the faint beating of his own heart. He felt both exhilarated and burdened. The trap door had opened not just into a cellar, but into a legacy. It had given him a responsibility he had never asked for. The weight of history sat heavy in his hands, whispering that what he chose to do next would matter. At last he rose, slipping the diary into his bag. He took one last sweep of the lantern around the chamber, its light catching on rusted steel and faded paper, and then he turned back to the stairs. Each step upward seemed heavier than the last, as though the underground pulled at him, unwilling to let him go. When he finally emerged into the barn above, the daylight felt too bright, the air too thin. He replaced the boards over the opening, but he knew there was no sealing it again. The barn had surrendered its first secrets, and there were more waiting. As he closed the doors and stepped outside into the pale glow of evening, Marcus looked back at the weathered structure. He felt changed, as though the descent had altered something fundamental in him. The barn was no longer just his dream of ownership. It was a threshold, a doorway into histories that had been left to rot. And now those histories belonged to him, whether he wanted them or not. The days after Marcus's descent into the underground chamber moved in a haze of unease. He had left the barn that evening clutching the diary to his chest, his truck rumbling down the dirt road while the pages whispered from the passenger seat beside him. The drive home felt different, as though he carried more than just paper and mildew in that worn leather binding. He carried the pulse of another man's life, a pulse that seemed still to beat faintly beneath his fingertips. That night, when he spread the book open on the small kitchen table of his rented house, he realized with a tightening in his chest that his purchase of the barn had not been the end of a journey, but the beginning of one. The diary was a labyrinth. The writing began decades earlier in a firm, confident hand, each line sharp and precise. But as the years progressed, the script grew looser, hurried, sometimes shaky. It was not the ramblings of an idle man. It was a record of obsession. The pages told of trades conducted in shadows, of dealerships gone bankrupt whose inventories were scooped up quietly, of mechanics who sold him their entire stock when times grew lean. He had bought engines by the dozen, motorcycles by the crate, boxes of parts and spares. The more Marcus read, the clearer the picture became. The man who once owned the barn had not been simply a farmer. He had been a collector of machines, a hoarder of history, a man who believed he alone could preserve what the world was content to discard. There was pride in his words. He described engines with the tenderness another man might reserve for describing his children. He spoke of chrome shining in the light, of leather seats that smelled of oil and sun, of the hum of pistons as though it were the song of angels. But threaded through the entries was something darker, something heavy with fear. He wrote of neighbors who had begun to ask questions, of men who came by night to peer through the slats, of the need to keep his collection hidden, safe, untouched. He sealed things away not only to protect them from rust and weather, but from prying eyes from the hands of the greedy. The underground chambers were not a simple cellar, but a vault, a fortress against a world he did not trust. Marcus sat in the dim light of his kitchen long after midnight, the diary spread open, his eyes burning as he forced himself to absorb more. He should have felt triumph, he told himself, for he had uncovered something no one else knew. But instead he felt the weight of the words pressing down on him. This was not just discovery, it was inheritance. The man's obsession, his secrecy, his desperate clinging to relics, it all seemed to seep from the ink into Marcus's skin. He closed the diary abruptly and shoved it away. But sleep came only in fragments, broken by dreams of rusted machines crowding closer and closer around him until he could not breathe. When morning came, he returned to the barn. He told himself it was to continue clearing the space, to bring order where chaos had reigned, but in truth, he could not stay away. The moment he pushed open the groaning doors, the familiar chill washed over him, and his eyes were drawn instinctively to the corner where the trapdoor lay hidden. He did not open it again that day, but he worked near it, his steps careful, his ears pricked for every sound. The barn felt alive now, as though aware that its secrets were no longer safe. Danger revealed itself in small ways at first. The ceiling above sagged ominously, water-stained beams bowing lower each time the rain fell. A section of floor near the center groaned and gave slightly under his weight, sending a jolt of fear through him. He realized with sharp clarity that the structure was not only old, but dying, and one wrong movement might be enough to bring it down upon him. Yet still he returned, unable to resist. He patched what he could with rough boards and nails, but each repair felt like binding wounds that would not stop bleeding. As if the barn's fragility were not enough, another danger began to creep in from outside. People noticed. They always noticed. In small towns, every change was a pebble dropped into still water, ripples spreading until they touched every shore. Marcus had purchased what no one else wanted, and at first there had been laughter, dismissive jokes about the fool with his collapsing barn. But as the days turned to weeks, the laughter shifted. Passing trucks slowed on the road as drivers craned their necks to glimpse what he was doing. Strangers asked casual questions at the diner, their voices light but their eyes sharp. Once, late in the evening, Marcus spotted two figures standing at the edge of the lot, silhouettes against the fading light, watching the barn with stillness that made his skin prickle. When he turned fully to face them, they slipped away into the weeds without a word. He began to feel hunted. The diary mentioned secrecy for a reason, and now Marcus understood. The man who had once locked his treasures beneath the earth had done so not only out of obsession, but out of necessity. There were always those who would take what they did not earn. Marcus carried that knowledge with him like a stone in his chest, and each time he unlocked the barn, he felt the invisible eyes of others upon him. The internal struggle grew unbearable. At night he argued with himself in silence, pacing his small room, torn between the impulse to keep everything hidden and the urge to share what he had found. Surely these machines, these relics, belonged in a museum or a collection where their history could be honored. But to expose them would mean to invite the world's hunger, to lose them to those who saw only dollar signs gleaming where he saw memory. The weight of decision gnawed at him. He thought of his father's dream, of land that could be a legacy, of ownership that meant freedom. But was he free, or had he only traded one burden for another? The barn creaked in the night wind like a ship ready to sink, and Marcus felt the past pressing closer with each day. The diary's words haunted him, mingling with the rusted artifacts below, until it was no longer clear where the old owner's obsession ended and his own began. He had inherited more than a building. He had inherited a secret that demanded a price. Whether that price would be his peace, his safety, or his very future, he did not yet know. But in the still hours before dawn, when the world was silent and he could hear his own breath too loudly, Marcus sensed that the choice would soon be forced upon him. The storm came on a night already heavy with dread. For days Marcus had felt the tension in the air, as if the barn itself had been holding its breath, waiting for some inevitable collapse. The diary weighed on his thoughts. The secrets below weighed on his conscience, and the suspicion of watchful eyes weighed on his nerves. He had patched beams with his own hands, nailed boards across gaping holes in the roof, but every strike of the hammer had felt like a plea against time. When the wind began to howl across the fields, and the first drops of rain spattered against his window, Marcus knew the night had come when all of his efforts would be tested. He did not try to sleep. Instead, he pulled on his boots and drove to the barn, the truck jostling along the muddy road as branches whipped against the windshield. The headlights cut across sheets of rain, illuminating the crooked outline of the structure as it loomed against a sky ripped open by lightning. It looked less like a barn than a shipwreck left to founder on the land. The doors shuddered as he pushed them open, the wind catching them with a violent force that nearly tore them from their hinges. Inside, the air smelled of wet wood and decay, every corner vibrating with the storm's fury. The roof groaned above him, a chorus of complaint that rose and fell with each gust. Water poured through cracks and holes, pooling on the floorboards, dripping down the beams in shining rivulets. Marcus's lantern beam swung wildly across the vast interior, catching on the wet sheen of rusted metal, on the pale blur of broken crates, on the dark shape of the trapdoor in its corner. He knew what he had to do. The barn was failing. If he left the relics below to the storm's mercy, they would be drowned, rotted, and lost forever. He secured the rope around a beam he trusted to hold and pulled the boards free from the trapdoor. The smell of the underground rushed up stronger than ever, the damp earth mixing with the scent of rainwater seeping downward. He descended quickly, the lantern swinging in his grasp, and felt the water already trickling across the floor below. The storm had found the chambers, forcing its way through cracks and stone, threatening to swallow everything. The underground, once silent and eternal, now echoed with the frantic rhythm of water dripping, gushing, running. Boxes sagged as their contents grew heavy with moisture, paper turning to pulp before his eyes. Metal gleamed where the lantern passed, but the gleam was that of corrosion taking hold. Marcus's heart pounded as he rushed from one relic to the next, torn between the desire to save everything and the knowledge that he could not. He seized what he could carry, the leather-bound diary, a stack of photographs sealed in plastic, a small crate of tools that still bore their polish. He dragged the chest that contained the motorcycle parts toward the stairs, his muscles screaming with effort. Above him, thunder cracked so loudly it shook the ground, dust raining from the ceiling. He imagined the barn collapsing, the stairs blocked, himself trapped below as the storm poured its fury into the earth. Fear pushed him harder. He hauled the chest one step at a time, his boots slipping on the wet stone, his breath ragged in his chest. When he finally reached the main floor, lightning illuminated the barn in a flash so white it seemed to burn the world clean. And for a heartbeat, Marcus saw the place not as ruin, but as glory. The skeletons of machines, the bones of history, all of it shining as though alive. Then the thunder rolled and the vision shattered, leaving only the storm's destruction. He worked without pause, dragging, lifting, shoving what he could toward the doors and into the back of his truck. The rain soaked him through, plastered his shirt to his skin, blurred his vision until all he could see was the blur of water and the shapes of objects that must not be lost. Each trip back inside felt more dangerous than the last. A beam cracked overhead and crashed to the floor where he had stood moments earlier. The loft groaned and sagged, a rain of splinters falling from above. Yet Marcus pressed on, unwilling to surrender what he had inherited. At last, when his strength threatened to abandon him, he realized there was no more time. The barn was collapsing around him. He staggered outside, arms laden with one final bundle wrapped in cloth, and turned back to watch as the storm claimed the rest. The roof bowed inward with a sound like a sigh, then split apart, sending a cascade of beams and shingles tumbling into the hollow interior. Sparks flared briefly as some hidden wire gave way. And then the barn was only ruin, the storm's victim, its secrets buried again in the wreckage. Marcus stood in the rain, chest heaving, and looked at what remained. He had saved only fragments compared to what had once been hidden below. Yet those fragments filled his truck bed, tangible proof that the past had not been entirely erased. The diary, now wrapped in tarpaulin, was safe. The photographs, the tools, the engine parts, all had survived by the strength of his will and the stubborn refusal to let them die. It was not everything, but it was enough. When dawn came, the storm broke, leaving the sky washed pale and clean. Marcus sat on the tailgate of his truck, soaked to the bone, and watched the steam rise from the ruined barn as the sun touched it. He felt no triumph, only exhaustion and a quiet certainty. The building was gone, but the story it held was not. It had chosen him as its keeper, and though he had nearly been buried with it, he had emerged with its heart intact. In the days that followed, townsfolk came to see the wreckage. Some shook their heads, muttering that they had known all along the place would collapse. Others eyed the truck bed with too much curiosity, their gazes lingering on the covered bundles. Marcus offered no explanation. He simply told them the storm had taken what was bound to fall. Let them gossip. Let them wonder. The truth was his alone to carry. He rented a small shed outside of town and moved his salvaged treasures there, arranging them carefully, almost reverently. Each item felt like a voice speaking from another time, and together they formed a chorus that demanded preservation. Marcus began sketching plans in a notebook of his own, not the ramblings of obsession, but a vision. He would restore what he could, display what could not be restored, and create a place where others could see the history that had been hidden in darkness. The barn had been a tomb. Now he would make of its remains a memorial. Sometimes at night, when the wind rose and rattled the windows, Marcus would think of the old owner whose diary now lay on his table. He would imagine the man watching, perhaps approving, perhaps jealous that another hand now turned the pages. But Marcus no longer felt haunted. He felt steadied. The past was not a curse but a responsibility, and he had accepted it. Standing one evening on the empty lot where the barn had stood, Marcus gazed across the field as the sun sank low, painting the sky in hues of fire. The ruin was overgrown already, weeds pushing up through broken beams, the earth reclaiming what had been taken. But in his mind he saw more, a rebuilt place, a space of memory and honor, a future shaped from fragments of the past. The townsfolk could laugh if they wished. He knew now that what he had bought was more than land and wood. He had bought a story, a legacy, and perhaps even a destiny. For the first time in years, Marcus felt at peace. The storm had tested him, the ruin had nearly claimed him, but he had endured. And in the quiet of the fading light, with the weight of the diary in his hands and the promise of work ahead, he understood that the barn had not destroyed him. It had remade him. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss what's coming next. There are even more shocking discoveries and unbelievable true stories waiting for you. Check out the next video right here on the channel. And if this blew your mind, share it with your friends so they can experience it too.